announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
Just before dawn, in the tense waters of the Middle East, one of the most powerful warships ever built drifted through a sea that looked deceptively calm. The nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. was conducting routine flight operations, its deck lights cutting sharp lines across the darkness. Fighter jets had been cycling through night drills. Radar screens glowed steadily. Everything appeared under control, until it wasn't. At 0317 local time, a faint acoustic anomaly rippled across the sonar arrays of an escorting destroyer. At first, operators dismissed it as background noise, merchant traffic, shifting currents, the usual clutter of a crowded maritime corridor. But seconds later, the signal sharpened. It had rhythm, mechanical rhythm, something submerged, something moving with intent. Within minutes, the carrier strike group shifted from routine posture to silent alert. Communications tightened, flight operations paused. Anti-submarine helicopters were redirected mid-pattern. Beneath the surface, according to later intelligence leaks, an Iranian diesel-electric submarine had maneuvered into the outer defensive ring of the formation. Valued at roughly $100 million and optimized for shallow water stealth, it was operating in one of the most strategically sensitive choke points on the planet. What happened next remains officially unconfirmed, but multiple defense sources describe a high-stakes underwater chess match that lasted nearly 40 minutes. The submarine reportedly reduced speed to near silence, attempting to exploit thermal layers in the water to mask its acoustic signature. Meanwhile, American escorts deployed sonar buoys in a widening grid, trying to pin down the intruder's exact coordinates. Then came the moment that changed everything. According to insiders, targeting systems aboard the submarine briefly locked onto the carrier. No torpedoes were fired, no missiles launched. But in modern naval warfare, a targeting lock can be as provocative as a shot across the bow. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, alarms reportedly flared as electronic systems detected an active scan originating from below. The response was immediate and calculated. A U.S. helicopter dropped practice depth charges at a safe but unmistakably close distance, an unambiguous warning. At the same time, one of the escorting ships transmitted a coded signal across emergency maritime channels, demanding the unidentified vessel surface and identify itself. Instead, the contact vanished. For tense minutes, sonar screens went blank. Had the submarine escaped? Had it repositioned for something worse? Pilots waited in cockpits. Crews braced at battle stations. Analysts in Washington monitored the situation in real time. When the submarine finally reappeared on sensors, it was moving away at increased speed, heading toward territorial waters. The confrontation ended without a single confirmed weapon discharge. But behind closed doors, military officials reportedly described the incident as one of the closest underwater challenges to a U.S. carrier group in years. Was it a deliberate test of American defenses? A calculated show of force? Or a risky maneuver that nearly spiraled into open conflict? In the shadows beneath the waves, where detection is uncertain and seconds matter, power is measured not only by firepower, but by nerve. And on that night, both sides pushed the limits of how far they were willing to go without crossing the line into war. What really happened in those 40 minutes? And how close did the world come to a very different headline? In the days leading up to the incident, tensions in the Middle East had already been simmering beneath the surface, much like the waters through which the carrier strike group was moving. The nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Had entered the region as part of a scheduled deployment intended to reassure allies and reinforce freedom of navigation in strategically vital sea lanes. Official statements described the mission as routine. Unofficially, however, the timing was anything but random. Just a week earlier, regional militias aligned with Tehran had intensified rhetoric against American naval presence, and Iranian state media had broadcast footage of naval exercises emphasizing submarine warfare in confined waters. The USS Gerald R. the lead ship of her class and one of the most advanced aircraft carriers ever constructed, was operating with a full complement of escort vessels. guided missile destroyers equipped with Aegis combat systems, a cruiser tasked with air defense coordination, and support ships trailing at a secure distance. The carrier itself, displacing more than 100,000 tons and powered by 2 nuclear reactors, was conducting night flight operations in international waters. F/A-18 Super Hornets and surveillance aircraft cycled through drills designed to maintain readiness in contested environments. The deck was alive with controlled urgency, the choreography of a crew trained for high-intensity scenarios. The region in which they sailed has long been recognized as one of the world's most strategically sensitive maritime corridors. Narrow shipping lanes, heavy commercial traffic, fluctuating thermal layers beneath the surface, and relatively shallow depths create a complex operational environment. Diesel-electric submarines, such as those operated by Iran, are particularly well suited to such waters. Unlike nuclear submarines, they can operate on battery power for limited periods, significantly reducing their acoustic signature. Iran's submarine fleet includes smaller coastal submarines as well as larger Kilo-class boats, acquired decades ago and subsequently modernized. Publicly available defense analyses have repeatedly noted that in confined seas, these submarines can present a detection challenge even to advanced naval forces. On the evening before the confrontation, weather conditions were stable, but visibility was limited by a thin marine haze. Sea state was moderate, with gentle swells that subtly complicated sonar performance. According to later briefings, the strike group had already elevated its defensive posture to what officers described as a measured readiness level, reflecting broader regional instability. Anti-submarine warfare assets were active but not in crisis mode. Helicopters equipped with dipping sonar conducted periodic sweeps, and escort ships maintained layered detection coverage around the carrier. What was not publicly acknowledged at the time, but later hinted at in defense commentary, was that U.S. intelligence had detected increased Iranian naval communications traffic earlier that week. Analysts could not conclusively determine whether it signaled a planned operation or routine training. Yet the pattern was unusual enough to draw attention. At the same time, Iranian naval officials had made pointed remarks about their ability to monitor and approach foreign vessels operating near their waters, statements widely interpreted as strategic messaging rather than literal claims. As midnight passed, operations aboard the carrier continued without visible disruption. Inside the Combat Information Center, radar and sonar data flowed across large digital displays. Watch teams rotated according to schedule, and pilots prepared for early morning sorties. Despite the outward normalcy, there was a subtle shift in atmosphere. Crew members later described an unspoken awareness that the region had grown more unpredictable. The memory of past maritime incidents, harassment by fast attack craft, drone overflights, and tense radio exchanges remained fresh in institutional memory. Roughly 2 hours before the first sonar anomaly was detected, one of the escorting destroyers recorded a faint, intermittent acoustic trace at the edge of its monitoring range. Initially categorized as biologic or commercial interference, it did not trigger immediate alarm. However, the contact's persistence prompted operators to flag it for continued observation. In retrospect, some officials would argue that this was the earliest indication that a foreign submarine had begun shadowing the strike group from a cautious distance. Thus, when the decisive moment finally arrived in the early hours before dawn, it did not emerge from calm waters alone. It was the product of mounting regional pressure, calculated signaling, advanced naval capability on both sides, and an environment where even routine patrols carry the potential for sudden escalation. The stage had been quietly set long before anyone realized how close the two forces would come. When the first clear acoustic alert flashed across the sonar console, the atmosphere inside the strike group shifted instantly from measured vigilance to focused urgency. Aboard one of the escorting destroyers protecting the USS Gerald R. Sonar operators had been monitoring routine background noise typical of heavily trafficked regional waters, merchant vessels, distant engines, shifting currents reverberating off uneven seabeds. But this signal was different. It was narrow-band, mechanically consistent, and moving against the expected flow of civilian traffic. Within seconds, the contact was upgraded from uncertain to probable submarine. Modern U.S. carrier strike groups are built around layered defense, and anti-submarine warfare is one of their most critical components. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, equipped with sophisticated sonar suites and linked through the Aegis combat system, form an outer detection ring around the carrier. Towed array sonar systems trail behind these ships, listening for faint signatures across miles of ocean. In addition, MH-60R Seahawk helicopters provide airborne anti-submarine coverage, capable of deploying sonar buoys and dipping sonar systems to localize underwater contacts. All of these assets are tied together through secure data links, allowing rapid cross-verification of targets. At 3:17 local time, the destroyer's tactical action officer ordered a rapid passive classification. The sonar team began analyzing blade rate harmonics, distinctive acoustic patterns produced by propellers. According to later defense commentary, the frequency signature loosely matched known profiles of Iranian diesel-electric submarines, possibly a modernized Kilo class or one of the smaller coastal boats optimized for shallow water operations. While exact confirmation remained elusive, the contact's behavior suggested deliberate shadowing rather than random transit. On the flight deck of the carrier, pilots preparing for early sorties were abruptly instructed to hold. The shift from routine operations to anti-submarine posture required minimizing acoustic interference and clearing airspace for rotary wing assets. Within minutes, an MH-60R helicopter lifted off from an escorting ship, banking low over the dark water. Its crew deployed a pattern of sonobuoys, small floating sensors designed to listen beneath the surface and transmit acoustic data back to the strike group. The buoy grid expanded outward, forming a rough semicircle around the suspected contact's last known position. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, multiple screens displayed overlapping streams of sonar returns. Operators spoke in clipped, controlled phrases. The carrier itself does not rely solely on its own sensors in such situations. Instead, it depends heavily on its escorts to sanitize the surrounding waters. Still, defensive systems aboard the Ford were placed on elevated readiness. Close-in weapon systems were powered and aligned, not because torpedoes had been detected, but because doctrine demands layered preparedness when a submarine is suspected within operational range. As additional sonar buoys entered the water, triangulation improved. The contact appeared to be maneuvering slowly, adjusting depth in a pattern consistent with attempts to exploit thermal layers, variations in water temperature that can bend sound waves and complicate detection. This tactic is well documented in submarine operations worldwide and is particularly effective in regions where warm surface waters overlay cooler depths. Analysts later noted that the contact's maneuvers suggested a trained crew, carefully balancing stealth with situational awareness. Tension escalated further when one buoy briefly registered a stronger acoustic return, implying the submarine had altered course toward the strike group's center. Although the range remained beyond immediate torpedo launch parameters, the directional shift was enough to trigger a higher alert state. A second helicopter was launched to tighten the tracking envelope. Meanwhile, one of the destroyers adjusted course to create a potential barrier between the contact and the carrier. For nearly 10 minutes, the underwater pursuit resembled a silent duel. The submarine reduced speed, likely running on battery power to minimize noise. U.S. assets responded by narrowing the buoy pattern and shifting from broad area search to focused localization. At one point, the contact faded entirely from passive sensors, raising the possibility that it had gone ultra-quiet or settled temporarily near the seabed. The uncertainty was perhaps the most unsettling element. In submarine warfare, absence of data can be as alarming as confirmation. Then, abruptly, a fresh sonar return appeared several hundred meters from the previous fix, suggesting a calculated repositioning maneuver. The contact was still outside direct engagement range, but it was no longer ambiguous. The carrier strike group was no longer conducting routine patrol operations. It was actively tracking a foreign submarine operating close enough to demand decisive attention. The first alarm had become a full-spectrum anti-submarine operation, and every movement beneath the waves now carried strategic weight. As tracking tightened and the underwater contact continued to maneuver, the confrontation shifted from cautious detection to a calculated game of pressure and counterpressure. The submarine, already identified as a probable Iranian platform, began executing sharper depth changes and intermittent course alterations, suggesting an effort not merely to evade, but to probe. Analysts later assessed that its movements were consistent with tactical mapping, testing the reaction time and coordination of the carrier strike group protecting the USS Gerald R. In confined regional waters, submarines can use seabed contours and ambient noise from shipping traffic to complicate targeting solutions, and this contact appeared to be exploiting every environmental advantage available. At one stage, acoustic data indicated a brief acceleration followed by near silence, a classic maneuver designed to reposition before reducing speed to ultra-quiet levels. The sudden shift forced U.S. anti-submarine forces to recalculate the projected intercept path. Destroyers adjusted spacing to prevent the submarine from slipping through gaps in the defensive perimeter. Helicopter crews redeployed active sonar dips at carefully spaced intervals, sending pulses into the water column despite the tactical drawback of revealing their own search pattern. In submarine warfare, activating sonar is a deliberate choice. It sacrifices stealth for clarity. The decision signaled that commanders were no longer willing to rely solely on passive tracking. The submarine's next move escalated the stakes. Electronic support measures aboard one escort reportedly detected a short burst of emissions from below the surface, consistent with a fire control radar or targeting system briefly activating before going dark again. Such systems can be used for calibration rather than immediate attack, but the implication was unmistakable. In naval doctrine, illuminating a high-value unit with targeting systems can be interpreted as a simulated firing solution. Inside the strike group's command center, the assessment shifted from shadowing to potentially hostile intent. Rather than respond with immediate force, U.S. commanders opted for graduated signaling. A helicopter conducted a low pass and deployed a non-lethal practice depth charge at a calculated offset from the contact's estimated position. The explosive was set to detonate at a depth designed to produce a concussive warning without structural damage. The underwater blast reverberated across sonar screens, sending a clear acoustic message. The submarine had been located and could be engaged if necessary. At nearly the same moment, a destroyer broadcast a standardized underwater communication ping, a coded signal used internationally to indicate awareness and demand de-escalation. For several tense minutes, the submarine maintained silence. Then sonar picked up a slow but deliberate turn away from the carrier's projected track. The movement was subtle at first, prompting debate among operators about whether it represented genuine withdrawal or tactical repositioning. The possibility remained that the submarine could attempt to slip behind the formation or trail at a safer distance. To prevent that scenario, one escort executed a flanking maneuver, effectively narrowing the escape corridor and reinforcing the layered defense around the carrier. Reports later suggested that during this window, senior U.S. defense officials in Washington were informed in near real time. Secure communications linked the strike group to higher command authorities, who monitored the unfolding situation with acute awareness of its geopolitical implications. A miscalculation could have triggered rapid escalation in a region already strained by competing military postures. Yet doctrine also demanded that any credible threat to a carrier, one of the most strategically significant assets in the U.S. arsenal, be neutralized or deterred decisively. As tracking stabilized, additional sonar returns confirmed the submarine's increasing distance from the formation. Its speed remained moderate, not the full sprint of a vessel fleeing immediate danger, but consistent with controlled withdrawal. Analysts interpreted this as a signal in itself. The submarine had demonstrated proximity and capability without crossing the line into overt attack. In response, U.S. forces refrained from aggressive pursuit beyond a defined perimeter, maintaining surveillance rather than escalation. Above the surface, the strike group resumed limited flight operations, a visible sign that commanders assessed the immediate threat as contained. However, defensive readiness remained elevated. Air patrol patterns were adjusted to expand maritime domain awareness, and electronic monitoring continued at heightened sensitivity. The carrier's escorts maintained staggered positions designed to complicate any renewed underwater approach. Though no weapons had been fired in anger, the encounter had effectively tested response protocols under real conditions. In the aftermath, both sides engaged in carefully calibrated messaging. Iranian media outlets referenced naval readiness and the ability to operate undetected in regional waters, stopping short of confirming direct involvement. U.S. officials acknowledged routine interactions with foreign vessels without providing operational specifics. Behind the scenes, military analysts conducted detailed reviews of acoustic recordings, maneuver timelines, and decision sequences. Early internal assessment suggested that the strike group's anti-submarine coordination functioned as designed, though the submarine's ability to approach within contested range highlighted the persistent challenge posed by diesel-electric platforms in shallow seas. Strategically, the episode underscored a broader reality. Modern naval power is as much about perception and signaling as about firepower. The submarine's brief targeting emission, whether intended as calibration or provocation, demonstrated how thin the margin can be between surveillance and confrontation. The calibrated U.S. response, warning detonations, repositioning, and sustained tracking, reflected a doctrine aimed at deterrence without ignition. Both sides appeared to recognize the value of demonstrating capability while avoiding irreversible escalation. By the time the submarine disappeared beyond the outer monitoring envelope, the immediate crisis had passed. Yet the implications lingered. Carrier strike groups are designed to project power across oceans, but in constricted regional waters, they operate under constant scrutiny from adversaries seeking to test their defenses. Likewise, regional naval forces understand that approaching a carrier carries immense symbolic weight. In this encounter, nerve and restraint proved as decisive as technology. The underwater duel ended without casualties or confirmed damage, but it reinforced a sobering truth shared by naval strategists worldwide. In contested seas, even a simulated move can ripple outward into strategic consequence. In the days following the confrontation, attention shifted from the immediate tactical drama to its broader implications. Military analysts within the U.S. Navy conducted a comprehensive after-action review focused on timing, coordination, and acoustic tracking efficiency. While officials publicly characterized the encounter as a professional interaction in international waters, privately it was reportedly described as one of the more assertive submarine approaches toward a U.S. carrier group in recent regional history. The fact that the submarine had managed to close distance, despite the layered defenses surrounding the USS Gerald R. was enough to prompt renewed emphasis on anti-submarine drills across deployed fleets. Strategically, neither side could claim an outright victory, yet both extracted value from the incident. For the United States, the event reinforced the credibility of its rapid detection and coordinated response systems. Naval planners highlighted the effectiveness of integrated air-sea operations and the discipline shown in avoiding premature escalation. For Iran, even without formal acknowledgement, the mere perception that one of its submarines had operated in proximity to the world's most advanced aircraft carrier carried symbolic weight. In asymmetric maritime strategy, symbolism can be as influential as direct engagement. Regional allies quietly expressed concern about how close the episode may have come to miscalculation. Gulf states that rely heavily on stable maritime transit routes were particularly sensitive to the risk of escalation. Energy markets reflected this unease. Crude oil prices experienced a brief uptick in the immediate aftermath as traders reacted to reports of heightened naval activity. Although the spike was modest and short-lived, it underscored how even limited naval encounters can ripple into global economic systems. Defense observers also pointed to the technological lessons embedded in the standoff. Diesel-electric submarines, especially when operating on battery power in shallow or thermally complex waters, remain difficult to track despite advances in sonar and data fusion. The incident served as a reminder that while aircraft carriers symbolize overwhelming power projection, they are not invulnerable. Their protection depends on constant vigilance, layered defenses, and disciplined command decisions under pressure. In classified discussions, according to later reporting, U.S. planners debated whether to expand the deployment of unmanned underwater vehicles to extend detection ranges in constrained maritime environments. Politically, the confrontation became part of a broader narrative of controlled rivalry. Public statements on both sides were calibrated to avoid direct accusations, while subtly reinforcing national resolve. Analysts interpreted this as a deliberate choice to prevent the episode from escalating into a diplomatic crisis. The absence of damage or casualties allowed leaders to frame the event as a demonstration of readiness rather than a provocation demanding retaliation. Ultimately, the most significant outcome may have been intangible. The encounter reinforced the reality that in contested regions, major powers operate in constant proximity, often separated by seconds and sonar pings rather than visible borders. Each maneuver, each signal, each calculated restraint contributes to an ongoing strategic dialogue beneath the surface. The standoff ended without missiles or torpedoes, but it left behind a clear message understood by naval commanders on both sides. The margin between deterrence and confrontation remains narrow, and the next encounter may depend not only on technology, but on judgment.